It didn't begin with a fight. It began with a question, a simple one, the kind that sounds harmless. "Are you happy?" Mara blinked. The question came from her husband, David, who was sipping coffee at the kitchen table on a quiet Sunday morning. The same table they'd sat at for 15 years, the same routine, the same conversations, or lack of them. The question hung in the air, unanswered, and it split something inside her. Not because she was angry, not because she was sad, but because she didn't know. It was in that silence that Mara realized something terrifying. She hadn't asked herself that question in years. She smiled faintly, the way you do when you want to avoid something dangerous. "Of course," she said, but even she could hear the lie in her voice. That night she stood in the bathroom, staring into the mirror. Her own reflection looked unfamiliar. Her face was the same, her eyes still brown, her lips still full, but there was a hollowness behind her gaze, like she'd been fading slowly, bit by bit. Without noticing, she tried to trace back where it had all begun, the erosion. It wasn't one big event. There had been no betrayal, no screaming matches, no slammed doors, just a slow dimming of light, a quietness that used to feel peaceful, but now felt suffocating. When she first met David, everything was vivid. He made her laugh, made her feel seen. He was attentive, gentle, proud to call her his. But over the years, life crept in, schedules, children, deadlines, grocery lists. They talked more about logistics than dreams, more about what to cook than what they were becoming. And somehow, somewhere, they stopped seeing each other. Mara wasn't unhappy, not exactly. She was numb, like she'd pressed pause on her soul and forgotten to hit play again. She remembered her mother once saying, "Marriage is about compromise." But no one had warned her that compromise could become self-erasure, that you could wake up one day and not recognize your own desires, that you'd learn to stop asking for things just because you're tired of hearing yourself not be heard. And so she played her part. She kissed him goodnight. She helped the kids with homework. She hosted dinner parties, folded laundry, scheduled dentist appointments. She was efficient, kind, reliable. She was everything except alive. The question haunted her. Are you happy? In the days that followed, Mara began to look at her life with new eyes. She noticed how many things she did out of habit rather than joy. How often she said, "I'm fine," when she wasn't. How long it had been since she laughed and meant it. She realized she had become a supporting character in her own story. The tragedy wasn't in the routines. It was in the forgetting who she was before she became a wife, a mother, a caretaker, before she became the person who made sure everyone else was okay. What about her? The thought hit like thunder. I don't hate him. I just don't feel anything anymore. And that was worse. Because at least hate is alive. Hate has energy. But indifference is the death of connection. She didn't tell anyone, not yet. Not even her closest friends. How do you explain a heartbreak that has no villain? How do you say, "I think my marriage is dying," when your husband still kisses your forehead and brings home groceries? But deep down, she knew something had shifted. Not outside, inside. She started taking longer walks, not to escape, but to think, to listen, to the quiet voice inside that she had ignored for too long. And that voice was growing louder. It wasn't saying, "Leave him." It wasn't saying, "Stay." It was saying something far more terrifying. "Remember who you are." And so Mara began to ask herself the question every day. Are you happy? She didn't always know the answer, but she finally had the courage to ask. Change doesn't always begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it begins in the smallest moments, the pause before a reply, the glance that lingers too long, the sigh at the end of a sentence. For Mara, it began with noticing the cracks, not just in herself, but in the women around her. The next week, she went to that brunch her friend had invited her to. They sat on a patio under a soft spring sun, surrounded by the scent of blooming jasmine and the clatter of silverware. Everyone laughed, swapped recipes, talked about their children's schools. But Mara wasn't really listening. She was watching. It was in the way Layla stirred her tea 5 times before taking a sip, never looking up. In the way Rosa smiled a second too late, like her mind was always somewhere else. And in the way Nina kept checking her phone, not out of urgency, but out of avoidance. They all looked fine, and yet they didn't. Halfway through the meal, someone joked about couples therapy. It was meant to be light-hearted, but Layla suddenly said, "I'd go, but I think we passed the point of therapy 10 years ago." Everyone went quiet. Then someone changed the subject, but Mara couldn't let it go. After brunch, she walked with Layla to the parking lot. "Do you really think it's too late?" she asked. Layla shrugged. "I don't even know what we'd fix. It's not like he's done anything wrong. It's just nothing feels right anymore." And there it was, the unspoken truth, the ache that doesn't come from betrayal, but from slow erosion. That night Mara couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Layla's words in her mind. They sounded so much like her own thoughts, only spoken aloud. The next day she called Layla. "Do you want to come over tonight, just to talk?" Layla said yes, and so began something unexpected, a safe space, a place where they could drop the masks. At first it was just the two of them, sharing wine, laughter, stories, tears. Then Rosa joined, then Nina. Soon it became a weekly ritual, no rules, no judgments, just truth. "I fantasize about running away. I love him, but I don't know if I'm in love with him. Sometimes I feel like I've disappeared into my own life." No one offered advice. They offered presence. One night, after everyone had gone, Mara sat alone and realized something profound. These conversations weren't about leaving or staying. They were about returning to oneself. In a world that taught them to prioritize everyone else, these women were reclaiming their right to be heard, to be seen, to feel. And for Mara, it was like breathing for the first time after holding her breath for years. She started journaling, not about her husband or her children, but about herself, her dreams, her fears, her longings. She didn't know what she wanted, but she finally knew what she didn't. A life lived in numbness. The gatherings continued. The group grew. More women came, some hesitant, some broken, all brave. They didn't come for solutions. They came for honesty. And in that honesty, something beautiful happened. They began to remember who they were before they became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's backbone. They began to imagine futures that weren't just about survival. And Mara, for the first time in a long time, felt not just alive, but awake. Not everything was clear, not every marriage would survive, but each woman was slowly learning to love the most important person in their life, herself. And that love, once found, changed everything. Mara didn't make a loud declaration. There was no slammed door, no dramatic suitcase by the stairs, just silence. And inside that silence, a shift. It began subtly. She stopped asking David how his day was because she already knew the answer. She no longer corrected the way he loaded the dishwasher or reminded him to call his mother. Not because she was angry, but because she no longer felt invested in the performance of care. One night, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Mara realized she didn't know what to say. Not because she lacked words, but because she was tired of using them to pretend. David, sensing the distance, asked gently, "Is something wrong?" And for the first time, she didn't say, "I'm just tired." Instead, she said nothing. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not a monster, not a villain, but a man who had no idea she had vanished inside herself years ago. And that broke her even more. She had built a life with someone who didn't notice when her laughter turned hollow, who didn't ask why she no longer played music while cooking, who never wondered why she hadn't initiated a kiss in months. But maybe, she thought, it wasn't his fault. Maybe he had also been trying to survive the quiet collapse in his own way. Maybe he too had made peace with the silence. That night, Mara didn't sleep beside him. She curled up on the living room couch and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The next morning, when David asked if everything was okay, she simply said, "I don't know." And that was the truth. It wasn't that she wanted to leave. It wasn't that she wanted to stay. It was that she couldn't keep pretending. She began to reclaim tiny pieces of herself. She wore red lipstick again, not because David liked it, but because she did. She danced barefoot in the kitchen to old songs that reminded her of who she used to be. She reread books she once loved and took long walks without her phone. She didn't do it for attention. She did it to remember. At first, the changes confused David. He asked questions. He tried to joke. Then one day he asked, "Is this about us?" Mara paused, holding a cup of tea in both hands. "Yes," she said, and no. He looked hurt, defensive, confused, but she didn't try to fix it, because for once she wasn't making herself smaller to protect someone else's comfort. In her circle of women, similar stories began to unfold. Ayla started going to therapy, alone. Layla booked a solo weekend away, her first time without her kids in over a decade. Clara told her husband she wanted to sleep in a separate room, just to breathe. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of resurrection. They weren't running from their families. They were running toward themselves. And yet the grief still lingered, the guilt, the fear, because change, even when necessary, feels like betrayal to a life you built with care. Mara kept asking herself, is it selfish to want joy? Is it cruel to want more than fine? One evening David stood in the hallway and said, I miss us. Mara looked at him. I miss us too, she said, but I don't miss the version of me that forgot who she was. He nodded slowly. Then he asked, what do you want from me? Mara didn't answer right away. Then with a voice steady but soft, she said, I want to want you, but I can't want you until I feel like myself again. And that became their new beginning, or their gentle ending. Time would decide. But for Mara, the choice had already been made. She would no longer pretend, not for peace, not for tradition, not for anyone. And that silent decision, though invisible to the world, changed everything. Because once a woman stops pretending, there is no going back. They say the bravest thing a woman can do is come home, to herself. Not to a house, not to a role, but to the version of her that was once wild, soft, curious, and whole. And that's exactly what Mara was doing, without ceremony, without applause. She didn't pack a suitcase and disappear. She didn't announce a grand awakening. She simply began making different choices. Some were visible. She moved her belongings into the guest room. Others were invisible. She stopped explaining her feelings before she'd even finished having them. For the first time in years, Mara wasn't acting like a version of herself for someone else's approval. She wasn't managing David's emotions or smoothing over his disappointment. She wasn't playing the cool wife or the grateful mother or the easygoing woman who asked for nothing and accepted everything. She was simply being Mara. It wasn't easy. There were nights when she cried on the bathroom floor, terrified that she was ruining a perfectly acceptable life. There were days when she missed the comfort of routine, even if that routine had made her soul shrink. But each time she doubted, she would ask herself one question. What if this isn't the end? What if this is the beginning? That question anchored her. It reminded her that choosing herself wasn't destruction, it was creation. In the circle, things were changing too. Women who once whispered now spoke boldly. One night, Clara announced she was applying for a job in another city. I don't even know if I'll get it, she said, but I want to remember what it feels like to want something. Yelena began seeing someone, not secretly, but with quiet joy. He doesn't complete me, she said, but he reminds me I'm still alive. Even Ayla, the once resigned, confessed that she and her husband were going to counseling, not to save the old version of their marriage, but to build a new one. These women weren't chasing happiness like a prize. They were planting seeds of presence, courage, and truth, on their own terms. And Mara started writing, not to publish, not to be praised, just to hear her own voice. She wrote about the first time she lied to herself, about the tiny betrayals that had added up to a life that looked good but didn't feel right. She wrote about silence, about rage, about softness, about the difference between being wanted and being seen. One morning she read a line aloud to herself. I thought I had to choose between being loved and being free, but I was wrong. I just had to love myself enough to stop asking for permission. And in that moment, something inside her exhaled. David never became the enemy. He was a man with his own losses, his own blind spots, his own longing. They didn't scream at each other. They didn't destroy what they had with hatred. Instead, they released each other slowly, like hands unclasping after a long journey. There were days they still shared coffee, moments of real warmth. But the illusion, the pretending, the old performance was gone, and in its place, something else bloomed. Not romance, not regret, but respect. Respect for the truth, respect for the courage it took to stop lying, respect for the life that was still unfolding, separately, but with grace. When people asked Mara if she was divorced, she would pause, not because she was unsure of her status, but because the label felt so small for something so human. Instead, she'd smile and say, I came back to myself. That's the real story, because sometimes the most radical love story is the one where the woman finally chooses herself.